They demanded rent for my own kitchen, so I called the police and revealed who really owned everything. Can you believe what some families do to their own blood? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Her Light for more stories of resilience and truth. Have you ever experienced family betrayal that cut this deep? Tell us your story below. My name is Margaret Louise Henderson, and what I am about to tell you happened to me just 6 months ago in Montgomery, Alabama. I am 72 years old, and I thought I would seen everything life could throw at an old woman like me. I was wrong. It was a humid Tuesday morning in September when my daughter-in-law Stephanie marched into my kitchen. The kitchen I would design myself back in 1987 with a manila folder full of papers and an expression that could freeze sweet tea in July. "Margaret, we need to discuss your living situation," she announced, spreading documents across my kitchen table like she was dealing cards for poker. "David and I have been more than generous, but 8 months is long enough for a temporary arrangement." Temporary arrangement? I stared at her bleached blonde hair, perfectly styled even at 9 in the morning, and wondered when exactly I would become a temporary arrangement in the house I would build with my late husband Ernest. My son David shuffled in behind her, coffee mug in hand, avoiding my eyes like he used to do when he was 7 years old and had broken something valuable. He was 45 now, but that same guilty slouch gave him away every time. "Mom," he said, settling into the chair where his father used to read the morning paper, "we have been talking, and we think it would be fair if you started contributing to household expenses." Fair. I almost laughed out loud. This was the house where I would change David's diapers, nursed him through chickenpox, helped him with algebra homework at this very table. This was the house where Ernest and I had scrimped and saved for 15 years to pay off the mortgage. This was the house where I would spend 3 decades tending the garden, maintaining the appliances, and keeping everything perfect for the family I thought would always love me. "What kind of contribution are we talking about?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the tremor I felt starting in my chest. Stephanie slid a paper across the table with a flourish. "We have calculated your fair share of utilities, groceries, and household maintenance. $400 monthly should cover it." $400. That was more than half my Social Security check. The same Social Security I would been quietly contributing to their grocery budget for months without being asked, thinking I was helping family during tough times. I picked up the paper and read it slowly. Every expense was itemized: electricity, gas, water, garbage collection, internet, cable television, lawn care, home security system. Even cleaning supplies and toilet paper had a line item with my portion calculated to the penny. "This says I am responsible for 30% of everything," I observed. "That is fair," Stephanie replied, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the table. "There are 3 adults in this household. Equal shares. Equal shares. As if the woman who owned the house should pay the same as the 2 people living in it for free." "What if I cannot afford this?" I asked quietly. David finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes broke something inside my chest. "Mom, there are senior living communities that would love to have someone like you. Places where people your age can be around their peers, with activities and medical care nearby. Their peers like I was some kind of aged cheese that needed to be stored with similar products. You want me to move to a nursing home." "Not a nursing home," Stephanie corrected quickly. "Independent senior living, much more appropriate for your age and needs." My age and needs. I was 72, not 92. I drove myself to the grocery store, managed my own medications, and could still deadhead the roses better than anyone in the neighborhood. My only need had been companionship after Ernest died, which was why I would moved in with them in the first place. "Can I think about this?" I asked. "Of course," David said, relief flooding his voice. "Take your time, but we will need an answer by Friday." Friday, 4 days to decide whether to pay rent in my own home or be shipped off to what they considered more appropriate accommodations. After they left for work, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the itemized bill for existing in my own house. The morning light streamed through the window above the sink, the window Ernest had specially positioned to catch the sunrise because he knew I loved drinking coffee while watching the day begin. I remembered every detail of building this house. Ernest and I had saved for 3 years, just for the down payment. We would chosen every fixture, selected every paint color, argued lovingly over whether the kitchen cabinets should be oak or cherry. We would planted the magnolia tree in the front yard the day we moved in, and Ernest had promised it would be magnificent by the time we celebrated our 40th anniversary. He was right. The tree was magnificent. Ernest, sadly, had only made it to our 39th anniversary before the heart attack took him away 2 years ago. Now his son wanted to charge me rent to sit under the shade of the tree we would planted together. I spent the rest of that day walking through my house, really looking at it for the first time in months. In the living room, I traced my finger along the mantel Ernest had carved by hand during the winter of 1995. The den still had the built-in bookshelf where he would display his collection of Civil War histories. The master bedroom, now David and Stephanie's room, still had the walk-in closet I would specifically requested because I was tired of cramming my clothes into the tiny closets of our old apartment. Every corner held memories. Every room told the story of a life I would built with purpose and love, and now I was being asked to pay for the privilege of remembering. That night, I called my best friend Rose, who lived across town in one of those senior communities David had mentioned so enthusiastically. "Maggie," she said when I finished explaining the situation, "you need to call a lawyer. This isn't right. I don't want to fight with my own son." "Rose, honey, he is already fighting with you. He is just making you do it with one hand tied behind your back." Rose was 84 and sharp as a tack. She would move to Sunset Manor after her husband died, not because her children forced her, but because she wanted the convenience and social opportunities. The difference, she pointed out, was choice. "David and Stephanie are counting on you being too polite to fight back," she continued. "They are betting that you will just quietly disappear rather than cause a scene." Is that who you want to be? Was it? Was I the kind of woman who would shrink away from conflict even when that conflict involved my own dignity? I thought about Ernest, who had worked double shifts at the plant for 5 years to pay for this house ahead of schedule. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who had raised a son, buried a husband, and maintained a home for 7 decades. That woman wouldn't have paid rent to live in her own house. It was time to remember who I used to be. The next morning, Wednesday, I drove to the Montgomery County Courthouse. The building was an imposing brick structure with white columns and the kind of formal atmosphere that made my voice drop to a whisper automatically. At the records office, I requested the property file for my address. The clerk, a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, pulled up the information on her computer. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, frowning at the screen. "It looks like there has been some recent activity on this file. Your name is still listed as primary owner, but there is a power of attorney document filed last year giving David Henderson authorization to handle property matters." My heart sank. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means he can make decisions about taxes, insurance, maintenance, that sort of thing. But it doesn't transfer ownership. Your name is still on the deed as sole owner. Sole owner. The words hit me like cool water on a burn. "Could I get a certified copy of the deed?" I asked. "Absolutely. That will be $15. I paid gladly and waited while she printed and certified the document. When she handed it to me, I stared at my name printed clearly at the top. Margaret Louise Henderson, sole owner and proprietor. "Madam?" the clerk said gently. "You look like you have seen a ghost." "I am looking at my resurrection," I replied. Driving home with the deed in my purse felt like carrying a loaded weapon. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet, but knowing I had it changed everything. That afternoon, while David and Stephanie were at work, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I went through the house systematically, looking for any other documents they might have filed without my knowledge. In David's home office, formerly Ernest's workshop, I found a filing cabinet I would never seen before. Most of it was locked, but one drawer was open, filled with insurance papers, tax documents, and maintenance records. All of them listed David as the primary contact, with my name relegated to a secondary line or missing entirely. At the bottom of the drawer, I found something that made my blood turn cold. A printed email from a real estate agent discussing the Henderson property and its potential market value. The email was dated 2 weeks ago. They weren't just planning to charge me rent, they were planning to sell my house. I sat in Ernest's old chair, shaking with a fury I hadn't felt since David was a teenager, and had wrecked my car after promising not to drink at that graduation party. But this was worse than teenage stupidity. This was calculated adult betrayal. They thought I was too old, too trusting, too afraid of conflict to fight back. They were counting on my love for David to override my sense of self-preservation. They were gambling that I would choose family peace over personal dignity. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. That evening, when they returned from work, I was waiting in the living room with the deed spread open on the coffee table. "How was your day?" I asked pleasantly as they walked through the front door. "Fine, Mom," David said, loosening his tie. "Have you thought any more about our conversation yesterday?" "I have," I replied. "I have thought about it quite a lot. In fact, I did some research." Stephanie's eyes narrowed. "Research?" I gestured toward the coffee table. "I went to the courthouse today and requested a copy of the property deed. Fascinating reading." David went very still. "Mom, what are you getting at?" "I am getting at the fact that you two are charging rent to the person who owns this house. I am getting at the fact that you have been discussing selling my home with real estate agents without my knowledge. I am getting at the fact that you seem to think I am too senile to know when I am being swindled by my own child." The silence that followed was deafening. Stephanie's face had gone red, but David looked like he might be sick. "Mom, it is not like that," he started. "Then, what is it like, David? Explain to me how charging your mother rent to live in the house she owns is somehow reasonable." Stephanie found her voice first. "Margaret, you don't understand the financial pressures we are under. Property taxes, insurance, utilities, it all adds up. We have been carrying these expenses while you contribute nothing." "I contribute nothing." I stood up, and something in my voice made them both step backward. "I contributed the down payment for this house. I contributed 15 years of mortgage payments. I contributed the property taxes for 35 years. I contributed the insurance premiums, the maintenance costs, the utility bills, and every other expense associated with this home since before you were born." "Stephanie, that was then," she said defensively. "This is now. You are absolutely right. This is now. And now, I want you both out of my house." David's mouth fell open. "Mom, you cannot be serious." "I am deadly serious. You have until Friday, the same deadline you gave me, to find alternative accommodations." "You cannot throw us out," Stephanie sputtered. "We have rights, do you?" "What rights exactly? Did you pay for this house? Do you hold the deed? Are your names on the mortgage that was paid off 8 years ago?" I picked up the deed and held it toward them. "This document says, I have the right to decide who lives in my home, and I have decided it will not be people who see me as a financial burden rather than family." David was shaking his head. "Mom, we can work this out. We didn't mean to hurt your feelings." "Hurt my feelings," I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. "David, you tried to make me homeless in my own house. You conspired to sell my home without my consent. You reduced me to a line item in your budget. This isn't about hurt feelings. This is about respect, dignity, and basic human decency, all of which you have forgotten how to provide." Stephanie crossed her arms. "Fine. If that is how you want to play this, we will see what our lawyer has to say about it." "Excellent idea," I replied. "I will be very interested to hear what your lawyer says about squatting in someone else's home while planning to sell it without their permission." The word squatting hit them like a physical blow. They weren't tenants. They weren't even guests anymore. They were occupying my property without my consent. And now they knew that I knew it. "Friday," I repeated. 5 p.m. And don't think about taking anything that doesn't belong to you." I walked upstairs to my room, the small guest room they would relegated me to, and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From adrenaline, from the thrill of finally standing up for myself, after months of being treated like an unwanted houseguest in my own home. Through the thin walls, I could hear them arguing in frantic whispers. Stephanie's voice was high and angry. David's was low and defeated. They were realizing, perhaps for the first time, that they had seriously underestimated the woman they would been trying to push around. I sat on the edge of my bed and called Rose. "I did it," I said when she answered. "I told them to leave." "Good for you, honey. How do you feel?" I thought about it for a moment, terrified, exhilarated, proud. "Like I might throw up," Rose laughed. "That sounds about right. What is your next move?" "I guess I wait and see if they actually leave. And if they don't," I looked at the certified deed on my nightstand. "Then I learn how serious I really am about taking my life back." Thursday passed in tense silence. David and Stephanie spoke to each other in hushed tones, but didn't address me directly. I could see them making phone calls, presumably to lawyers and friends, looking for some way to challenge my authority. I spent the day cleaning the house and making plans. If they actually left, I would need to figure out how to manage on my own again. Could I afford the utilities and taxes on my Social Security? Probably, if I was careful. Would I be lonely? Possibly, but loneliness was better than being made to feel unwelcome in my own home. Friday morning arrived, gray and drizzly, typical Alabama weather for late September. I woke early, made coffee in my kitchen, and sat at my table watching the clock. At noon, David knocked on my door. "Mom, can we talk?" I opened the door to find him standing in the hallway with red eyes and rumpled clothes. He looked like he hadn't slept. "We found a place," he said quietly, "an apartment downtown. We can move in next week." I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that they were taking me seriously. Sadness that it had come to this. "David," I said, "I never wanted it to be this way. I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Mom, I am sorry. We were wrong. I don't know how we got so twisted around, but charging you rent was... It was terrible. Why did you do it?" He shrugged helplessly. "Money's been tight since Stephanie lost her job. The house is expensive to maintain. We started thinking of you as part of the household expenses instead of the person who gave us a home in the first place. I would have helped with expenses if you had asked. You didn't need to make me feel like a burden. I know that now. I am sorry, Mom. I really am." I studied my son's face, looking for the little boy I would raised, the teenager I would guided through heartbreak and mistakes, the young man I would been so proud of when he graduated college. He was still in there, underneath the stress and poor judgment. "David," I said carefully, "I don't want to lose you over this, but I also cannot live in a house where I am not wanted. You are wanted, Mom. I want you here. I handled this all wrong. What about Stephanie?" David's face fell. "Stephanie thinks you are manipulating the situation. She says you are using emotional blackmail to get your way." "And what do you think?" "I think I charged my widowed mother rent to live in the house she built, and I need to figure out how to live with that." We stood in the hallway for a long moment, years of love and recent hurt hanging between us like fog. "The apartment has a month-to-month lease," David said finally. "Maybe after some time apart, we can figure out how to be a family again." I nodded. "Maybe we can." That afternoon, I watched them load their belongings into a rental truck. Stephanie avoided looking at me, her mouth set in a hard line that suggested she blamed me entirely for their circumstances. David moved slowly, like a man carrying a weight he couldn't put down. As they prepared to leave, he came over to where I stood on the front porch. "Mom, will you call me in a few weeks?" "Of course I will call you. You are my son." He hugged me then, quick and awkward, like he wasn't sure he deserved the affection. When he let go, his eyes were bright with tears. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, David. That is why I couldn't let you keep treating me like I didn't matter." They drove away at sunset, the rental truck disappearing around the corner toward their new life downtown. I stood on my porch until the taillights vanished, then went inside my empty house. It was quiet. Not the oppressive quiet of being ignored, but the peaceful quiet of being alone by choice. I walked through each room, reclaiming space that had felt foreign for months. In the master bedroom, I opened the windows and aired out the stale atmosphere of resentment. In the kitchen, I moved my coffee mug back to its proper place in the cabinet, where I could reach it easily. This was my house again. My home, my sanctuary. But as I settled into bed that night, I realized something important. I didn't want to be alone forever. I wanted to share my home with people who valued me, who saw my presence as a gift rather than a burden. I wanted to rebuild my social connections, to remember what it felt like to be welcomed rather than tolerated. The next morning, Saturday, I called Rose. "How does it feel to be the queen of your castle again?" she asked. "Lonely," I admitted. "But free." "Well, then you are ready for the next chapter. There is a widowers and widows social group that meets at our community center every Wednesday evening. Nothing fancy, just coffee and conversation. You should come." "I don't know, Rose. I am not ready to start dating." "Who said anything about dating?" "I am talking about friendship, about being around people who understand what it is like to lose a spouse and start over. About remembering that there is a whole world full of people who might actually enjoy your company." I thought about it. "What would I wear?" Rose laughed. "Honey, wear whatever makes you feel like yourself. These people want to meet Margaret Henderson, not some dressed-up version you think they would prefer." Wednesday evening found me standing in the parking lot of Rose's community center, clutching a homemade apple pie and wondering if I was making a mistake. Through the windows, I could see a group of perhaps 20 people sitting in a circle, talking and laughing over coffee and pastries. "They look so comfortable together," I said to Rose, who had come out to escort me inside. "That is because most of them have been coming for months or years. But everyone was new once. Come on, I will introduce you around." The group welcomed me warmly, asking polite questions about where I lived and how long I would been widowed. Nobody pried into my recent family drama, and nobody made me feel like I needed to justify my presence. An elderly gentleman named Frank complimented my pie and asked if I would grown the apples myself. A woman named Virginia shared that she had been struggling with her lawn care since her husband died, and did I know any reliable services? A man named Charles mentioned that he had been thinking about taking a cooking class since he would never learn to prepare anything more complicated than scrambled eggs. These were my people, I realized. People who understood loss, who were rebuilding their lives one small step at a time, who valued connection over convenience. "Would you like to see the rest of the facility?" Frank asked as the meeting wound down. "We have a lovely garden area, and there is usually a good sunset view from the back patio." Frank was perhaps 75, with silver hair and warm brown eyes behind wire. Rimmed glasses, he walked with a slight limp but moved with the confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. "I would love to see the garden," I said. We walked slowly through the community center, past a library, a craft room, and a small cafe. The garden was indeed lovely, with raised beds full of late, seasoned vegetables and flower borders that would be spectacular in spring. "Do you garden?" Frank asked. "I used to. I had a beautiful yard before." I trailed off, not sure how to explain my recent circumstances before life got complicated. He suggested gently. "Something like that." We sat on a bench overlooking the garden, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Frank didn't press for details about my situation, and I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. "I lost my wife 2 years ago," he said eventually. "Cancer. We had 43 years together, raised 4 children, traveled to all 50 states. I thought I was prepared for being alone, but it turns out there is no preparing for the silence." "I know that silence," I said. "My husband died 2 years ago, too. Heart attack, sudden, very. One minute, he was reading the morning paper, complaining about the mayor's latest tax proposal. The next minute, he was gone." Frank nodded. At least you didn't have to watch him suffer. Small comfort. But something we sat together as darkness fell. Two people who understood the weight of unexpected solitude. When Frank offered to walk me to my car, I accepted gratefully. "Margaret," he said as I unlocked my door, "would you like to have dinner sometime? Nothing fancy, just two people who could use some company." I hesitated, thinking of Ernest, of the loyalty I still felt to his memory. But then I thought of the empty house waiting for me, of the long evenings with only television for conversation. "I would like that," I said. "How about Saturday? There is a nice little cafe downtown that serves excellent catfish." Saturday sounds perfect. Driving home through the quiet streets of Montgomery, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation. Not the dread of facing another confrontation or the anxiety of wondering whether I would made the right decision, but the simple pleasure of having something to look forward to. Frank picked me up promptly at 6 on Saturday, dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt that brought out the blue in his eyes. He opened my car door and complimented the yellow dress I would chosen, the one Ernest used to say, made me look like sunshine. The CF was small and cozy, with checkered tablecloths and the kind of menu that featured comfort food done well. Frank insisted I try the peach cobbler, which he claimed was the best in the county. "So tell me about yourself, Margaret," he said over dinner. "Rose mentioned you have been having some family difficulties." I found myself telling him the whole story: David and Stephanie's demands for rent, the discovery of the real estate emails, the confrontation over the deed, their eventual departure from my house. Frank listened without judgment, asking occasional questions, but mostly just letting me talk. "You did the right thing," he said when I finished. "Family relationships should be built on love and respect, not financial exploitation." I keep wondering if I was too harsh. "David is my only child. Margaret, you taught your son an important lesson about consequences. That is what good mothers do, even when their children are adults." We talked until the restaurant began preparing to close, sharing stories about our marriages, our children, our hopes for the future. Frank had been an engineer before retiring, and his wife had been a high school English teacher. His children lived scattered across the country, successful but distant. Like me, he was learning to navigate the space between independence and loneliness. "Would you like to see my workshop?" he asked as he drove me home. "I do woodworking as a hobby. Nothing fancy, but it keeps my hands busy." Frank's workshop was in his garage, filled with the organized chaos of someone who built things for joy rather than profit. He showed me a rocking chair he was making for his granddaughter, a jewelry box crafted from reclaimed barnwood, a set of cutting boards designed for a local church's fundraising auction. "My husband would have loved this space," I said, running my hand along a hand-carved picture frame. He was always building something. "What kinds of things?" "Birdhouses. Mostly, he must have built 50 of them over the years. I still have most of them stored in my garage. I would love to see them sometime. If you wouldn't mind sharing." The invitation slipped out before I could stop it. "Would you like to come over for dinner tomorrow? I could show you Ernest's collection, and I make a decent pot roast." Frank's smile was warm and genuine. I would be honored. Sunday dinner became a weekly tradition. Frank would arrive at my house promptly at 4, often bringing fresh flowers from his garden or vegetables from the farmer's market. We would cook together in my kitchen, sharing stories and laughter, while the afternoon light streamed through the windows Ernest had positioned so carefully. Frank never tried to replace Ernest in my heart or my memories. Instead, he created his own space, separate but equally valued. He was interested in who I was now, not who I would been in my marriage. He admired my strength without trying to manage it, my independence without trying to limit it. 3 months after David and Stephanie left, Frank helped me clean out the guest room they would occupy and transform it into a proper guest suite, the kind of space where welcome visitors would feel honored rather than tolerated. We painted the walls a warm cream color, hung new curtains, and added a comfortable reading chair by the window. "Are you expecting company?" Frank asked as we arranged fresh flowers on the dresser. I am preparing for the possibility of company, I replied. There is a difference, and if David wants to visit, I considered the question carefully. He has called twice since they moved out. Short conversations. But civil. He asks how I am doing, tells me about their new apartment, apologizes again for how things ended. I think he is learning. And Stephanie thinks I am a vindictive old woman who manipulated her husband into choosing me over her. She is not entirely wrong about David choosing me, but she is wrong about the manipulation. I simply reminded my son that I am his mother, not his tenant. Frank nodded approvingly. Self-respect isn't manipulation. It is survival that spring. Frank helped me restore Ernest's garden. We replanted the vegetable beds that had been neglected during my months of family turmoil, added new flower borders along the back fence, and repaired the irrigation system Ernest had installed years earlier. Working in the soil again, feeling the sun on my back and the satisfaction of nurturing growing things, reminded me of who I would been before grief and family conflict had made me forget my own strength. I was Margaret Henderson, gardener and homeowner, widow and survivor, woman and fighter. Frank and I were weeding the tomato plants one Saturday morning when a familiar car pulled into my driveway. David climbed out slowly, carrying a small wrapped package, and walked across the yard toward us. "Hello, Mom," he said quietly. "I hope it is okay that I stopped by." I stood up, brushing dirt off my gardening gloves, and studied my son's face. He looked thinner than I remembered. Older somehow, but his eyes held something they would been missing for months. "Humility, David. This is Frank Miller," I said. "Frank, my son David." The two men shook hands politely, sizing each other up with the careful courtesy of people who weren't sure what they meant to each other yet. "I brought you something," David said, offering me the package. An early birthday present. Inside the wrapping was a framed photograph of Ernest and me taken on our wedding day. Both of us young and hopeful and impossibly naive about what 40 years of marriage would bring. I would thought this picture was lost when they would moved out. "I found it in one of our boxes," David explained. "It didn't belong to us." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. This was always one of my favorites. We stood in awkward silence for a moment, three people trying to navigate the space between hurt and healing. "The garden looks wonderful," David said finally. "Dad would have loved seeing it like this again. Frank's been helping me restore it. He has a gift for growing things." Frank excused himself tactfully, saying he needed to check on something in his truck. Leaving David and me alone among the plants, Ernest had planned, and I was learning to tend again. "Mom, I need to tell you something," David said. "Stephanie and I are separating." I felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief. "I am sorry to hear that, are you?" "Really?" I considered his question honestly. "I am sorry that your marriage is ending. I am not sorry that I will not have to pretend to like someone who saw me as a problem, to be solved, rather than a person to be loved." David winced, but nodded. "That is fair. She never understood why I couldn't just put you somewhere. Put me somewhere," her words, not mine. "She thought you should go to senior living, that adult children shouldn't be responsible for their aging parents' housing." "Adult children aren't responsible for their parents' housing," I agreed. "But that wasn't the situation, was it? I wasn't asking you to house me. I was living in my own home and being charged rent for the privilege. I know. I know how wrong that was. I have been thinking about it for months, trying to understand how I got so twisted around, I think. I think I was scared. Scared of what? Scared of being responsible for you as you got older. Scared of the financial burden, the emotional weight, the changes it would mean for my life. Stephanie made it seem like charging you rent was a reasonable boundary, a way to keep things fair and structured. I sat down on the garden bench Frank had built for me, gesturing for David to join me. "David, do you remember when you broke your leg in high school during football season? Of course. You were devastated. Not just about the pain, but about missing the season. Disappointing your team, losing your starting position. You were convinced your life was over. I was 17. Everything felt like the end of the world. Do you remember what your father and I told you?" David was quiet for a moment, thinking, You said that sometimes life breaks you to teach you something important about healing. And what did we teach you about healing? That it takes time, that you cannot rush it. That being broken doesn't mean being worthless. I reached over and took his hand. I am 72 years old, David. My body is starting to age. My energy isn't what it used to be. And someday I will need more help than I need now. But I am not broken, I am not worthless, and I am not your burden to carry. Then, what are you? I am your mother. I am the woman who raised you to be better than the man who charged me rent to live in my own house. I am the woman who believes you can still become that better man, even after everything that has happened. David started crying then, the quiet tears of a middle-aged man who had disappointed himself as much as anyone else. I don't know how to fix this, Mom. You don't fix it. You learn from it. You decide who you want to be going forward, and you become that person one choice at a time. Frank returned from his truck, diplomatically, carrying a glass of water he offered to David. My son accepted it gratefully, wiping his eyes and trying to compose himself. Mr. Miller, David said, I owe you an apology too. I should have thanked you for being here for my mother, instead of wondering what your intentions were. Frank smiled gently. Your mother doesn't need anyone to be here for her, David. She is perfectly capable of taking care of herself. I am here because I enjoy her company, and she seems to tolerate mine. More than tolerate, I corrected, and Frank's cheeks colored slightly. David stayed for another hour, talking about his job, his apartment, his plans for the future. He asked about Frank's woodworking, complimented the garden improvements, and generally behaved like the polite, thoughtful man I would raised him to be. When he prepared to leave, he hugged me properly for the first time in years. Can I come back next weekend? He asked. Maybe help with the garden. You can come back anytime, I said. This is still your childhood home. It is still the place where you are always welcome. Even after everything, especially after everything. That is what home means, David. It is the place that holds space for your worst mistakes and your best possibilities. As David drove away, Frank put his arm around my shoulders. That was beautifully handled, he said. It was a beginning, I replied. Not a resolution, but a beginning. Are you hopeful? I thought about it, watching my son's car disappear around the corner, thinking about the long journey between betrayal and forgiveness, between disappointment and redemption. I am hopeful, I said finally. David made a terrible mistake, but he is not a terrible person. Sometimes good people do bad things when they are scared or pressured or convinced that wrong is right. The question isn't whether they are capable of change, it is whether they are willing to do the work change requires. And you think David is willing. I think David is learning that the cost of not changing is higher than the cost of admitting he was wrong. That is usually when real growth begins. Frank and I were married the following autumn. A simple ceremony in my backyard with Rose as my matron of honor and David as Frank's best man. Stephanie had finalized their divorce by then, and David was slowly rebuilding his relationship with me, one honest conversation at a time. We kept our separate homes but spent most of our time at mine, which had more space and better light for Frank's woodworking projects. He converted Ernest's old workshop into a proper studio, carefully preserving the birdhouse collection while adding his own tools and projects. Aren't you worried about people thinking you remarried too quickly? Rose asked, as she helped me choose flowers for my wedding bouquet. I am 73 years old. Rose, how much time am I supposed to waste worrying about other people's opinions? That is the spirit. What does David think about Frank? David thinks Frank makes me happy, and that is enough for him right now. He is learning that loving someone means wanting their joy, not controlling their choices. The wedding was perfect in its simplicity. Frank and I exchanged vows under the magnolia tree Ernest, and I had planted 40 years earlier, promising to cherish each other for whatever time we had left. David walked me down the aisle, his eyes bright with tears of happiness rather than regret. In my vows, I promised Frank love, companionship, and the kind of respect that sees strength as beautiful rather than threatening. In his vows, Frank promised me partnership, laughter, and the space to be myself without apology. We danced to The Way You Look Tonight on a small platform Frank had built specifically for the occasion, surrounded by friends who understood that love doesn't expire at 70 and happiness doesn't have an age limit. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Miller?" Frank asked, as we swayed together in the twilight. "It feels like coming home to myself," I replied, "like remembering who I was before I forgot who I could become." Now, 6 months later, I wake up each morning in the house I built with Ernest, next to the man I chose with my whole heart. Frank makes coffee while I tend the garden. We read the newspaper together over breakfast, arguing gently about politics and laughing at the comics. David visits every other weekend, sometimes staying for dinner, sometimes just stopping by to help with yard work or home repairs. He is dating someone new, a kind woman named Lisa who treats me like a mother-in-law rather than an inconvenience. Our relationship isn't what it was before the crisis, but it is something new and perhaps more honest. I learned something important from what happened with us. David told me recently as we planted spring bulbs together. "What is that?" I learned that love isn't about control or convenience. It is about creating space for people to be themselves, even when that is difficult or inconvenient for you. That is a hard lesson for a lot of people. I almost learned it too late. But you did learn it. That is what matters. The house holds all of our history now. The love I shared with Ernest, the pain of David's betrayal, the joy of Frank's companionship, the healing of family reconciliation. Every room tells multiple stories. Every corner holds layers of memory. But the story isn't finished. There are more seasons to tend in the garden, more projects for Frank to build in his workshop, more opportunities for David to practice being the son I raised him to be. Some people might call this a story about revenge, but they would be wrong. This is a story about reclamation, reclaiming my home, my dignity, my right to be valued rather than tolerated. It is about remembering that age doesn't equal helplessness, that politeness doesn't require self-erasure, that family love shouldn't come with a price tag. Most importantly, it is about the truth that it is never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to demand the respect you deserve, never too late to choose happiness over convenience. I am Margaret Louise Henderson Miller, and this is my house, my life, my story. I built it with my own hands, defended it with my own voice, and share it now with people who see my presence as a gift rather than a burden. And I am not done writing yet. Thank you for staying with me through every single word of this journey. If this story touched something deep in your heart, whether it sparked recognition, anger, or that quiet satisfaction that comes when justice finally arrives, then you understand what too many people choose to ignore, that real strength doesn't always announce itself with volume. Sometimes it speaks in documents. Sometimes it shows up with evidence. Sometimes it sits quietly on a porch it reclaimed, watching the sunrise through windows it chose, needing no applause, because the victory was always deeply personal. This was never just about a house, was it? This was about dignity, about memory, about the difference between being loved and being tolerated, about refusing to shrink yourself small enough to fit inside someone else's convenience. It was about every woman who has been told she should be grateful for basic human decency, every mother who has been made to feel like a burden rather than a blessing, every grandmother asked to apologize for taking up space in a world she helped build. If you saw yourself in my story, or someone you love, or someone you worry about becoming, please know this: you are not invisible, you are not small, you are not expired. Your voice matters because you breathe, not because others find it convenient. You deserve respect because you are human, not because you have earned it through endless service to people who have forgotten your value. If you believe that the quietest voices often carry the most powerful truths, then I want to invite you to subscribe to her light. This isn't a channel about seeking pity or promoting bitterness. This is a place for clarity, for closure, for the kind of courage that changes everything without raising its voice. Here at Her Light, we share the stories that others dismiss, the experiences whispered behind closed doors, minimized at family gatherings, swept under rugs by people who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. We give voice to the women whose stories echo through generations, waiting for someone brave enough to listen and strong enough to understand. We don't chase drama for entertainment. We don't scream for attention. We remember. We reveal. We remind the world that dignity has no expiration date, that wisdom increases with age, that the women society tries to silence often have the most important things to say. When a woman speaks her truth, especially a woman who has been told her time has passed, the whole world should listen. So if you want more stories like this, stories of quiet resilience, unexpected justice, and the kind of strength that doesn't need permission to stand tall, click that subscribe button right now. Join our growing family that believes in truth without theatrics, justice without judgment, and power that proves itself through actions rather than volume. Subscribe to her light today, because some stories need to be told, some truths demand to be heard, and some lights, once lit, can never be extinguished. Her light illuminates the stories that matter most. Subscribe now and help us keep shining bright.